The dust hung in the air like a brown curtain, suspended between earth and sky, as the two small figures made their way down the rutted trail. The older girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her dress torn and stained with dirt and something darker, her bare feet bleeding from the rocks that littered the path. In her thin arms she carried her sister, a child of perhaps 6, whose face burned with fever and whose shallow breaths came in ragged gasps that pierced the hot afternoon silence. The girl's name was Sarah, though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in so long that it felt like a name belonging to someone else, someone from a different life. Her sister, Emma, had stopped crying 2 hours ago, and that silence frightened Sarah more than any sound could have. She adjusted her grip, feeling Emma's small body grow heavier with each step, though the child weighed almost nothing at all. The fever had been burning for 3 days now, ever since they had fled their uncle's ranch in the dead of night. Sarah tried not to think about what they had left behind. She tried not to remember the smell of whiskey that always preceded her uncle's rage, or the sound of his heavy boots on the wooden floors, or the way her aunt would turn away, her face a mask of practiced ignorance. She tried not to remember the night Emma had begged for water and been locked in the cellar instead, or the morning Sarah had found her sister shaking and soaked with sweat, her lips cracked and bleeding. They had run because staying meant dying, but running might mean dying too, and Sarah was learning that sometimes there were no good choices, only choices that might let you live one more day. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of scrub grass and red earth broken only by occasional clusters of juniper trees that offered no shade worth seeking. The sun hung overhead like a brass coin, unmerciful and absolute. Sarah's tongue felt thick in her mouth, and she could not remember the last time she had tasted water that didn't smell of rust and rot. They had finished the last of their small canteen yesterday morning, and Emma had drunk most of it, which was as it should be. Sarah told herself that big sisters could last longer without water, that their bodies were stronger, more capable. She told herself many things to keep her feet moving. In the distance, shimmering through the heat waves, Sarah saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A building. No, several buildings. A ranch, perhaps, or a small settlement. She had been following the trail for 2 days, knowing that trails led somewhere, that people carved paths through wilderness for a reason. The buildings grew more solid as she walked, taking on shape and substance, transforming from mirage to reality. There was a main house, painted white but grayed with age and dust, and beside it a barn with faded red walls. A corral stood empty, its fence posts leaning at tired angles. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady, and that smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people meant the terrifying possibility of either salvation or damnation. Sarah stopped at the edge of the property, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Emma stirred in her arms, making a small sound like a wounded bird, and Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back. Crying used water the body needed for other things. She studied the house, looking for signs of what kind of people might live there. The yard was swept clean. A rocking chair sat on the porch, its runners worn smooth with use. Curtains hung in the windows, clean and white. These details meant something, though Sarah was not sure what. Her experience with humanity had taught her that cruelty could hide behind any door, wearing any face. But Emma was dying. Sarah knew this with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone. The fever had grown worse through the night, and now Emma's skin felt like touching the side of a stove. Her breathing rattled in her chest, wet and thick, and she had not opened her eyes since sunrise. If Sarah did nothing, her sister would die in her arms before the sun set again. And if she knocked on that door and found cruel people inside, at least they would die together. And there was a mercy in that too. She walked toward the house on legs that barely remembered how to hold her weight. Each step felt like a small act of courage or foolishness, and she was too tired to know which. The porch stairs seemed impossibly high, but she climbed them, feeling splinters drive into her already damaged feet. She stood before the door, and for a long moment she simply stared at it, this barrier between one version of her life and whatever came next. Then she raised one small fist and knocked 3 times, the sound absurdly loud in the afternoon stillness. Nothing happened. Sarah waited, counting her heartbeats, feeling Emma's fever heat against her chest. She knocked again. Harder, desperation making her bold, still nothing. Panic began to rise in her throat. What if no one was home? What if she had imagined the smoke? What if she had carried her sister all this way only to die on a stranger's porch? She pounded on the door with the side of her fist, again and again, no longer caring about propriety or fear, caring only that anyone might hear. The door opened so suddenly that Sarah nearly fell forward. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and years, his gray hair falling past his collar. He wore a simple shirt and canvas pants, held up by worn suspenders, and in his hand he held a book, his finger marking his place. His eyes, pale blue and startling in his tanned face, took in the sight before him with an expression Sarah could not read. He looked at her, then at Emma, then back at her, and Sarah saw something shift in his gaze, something that might have been recognition or memory or pain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah tried to find words but could not remember how they worked, how to arrange them into meaning. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges, and she realized she was swaying on her feet. Please. The word came out as barely a whisper, cracked and desperate. Please help her, she's sick. Please. The man moved with surprising speed for someone his size. He stepped forward and took Emma from Sarah's arms with a gentleness that made Sarah's throat tighten. The sudden absence of her sister's weight was so disorienting that Sarah's knees buckled, but the man caught her elbow with his free hand, steadying her. Come inside. His voice was deep and rough, like stones tumbling in a river. Quickly now. Sarah followed him into the house, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness after the brutal sunlight. The interior was simple but clean, with wooden floors worn smooth by time and bare walls that held only a few simple decorations. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a pot hanging over low flames. The smell of cooking beans filled the air, and Sarah's stomach cramped painfully at the scent of food. The man carried Emma to a bedroom off the main room and laid her on the bed with the same careful gentleness. He placed his large hand against her forehead, then her neck, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten. How long has she been fevered? He asked, not looking at Sarah. 3 days, Sarah said, maybe 4. I lost count. The man nodded and moved to a washstand in the corner. He poured water from a pitcher into a basin and brought it back to the bed along with clean cloths. What's your name, child? He asked as he began to sponge Emma's face and neck with cool water. Sarah, and she's Emma. I'm Thomas Wade. He dipped the cloth again, wringing it out before placing it on Emma's forehead. Where are your parents, Sarah? Dead. The lie came easily, automatically. It was simpler than the truth and safer. Thomas glanced at her, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew she was lying but was choosing not to challenge her. He continued his work in silence, changing the cloths frequently, his movements practiced and sure. Sarah stood by the door, suddenly afraid to come closer, afraid that if she sat down or relaxed for even a moment, her body would give up entirely. Sit, Thomas said without looking at her. Before you fall down. Sarah sat in a wooden chair by the wall, and the relief of it nearly made her weep. She watched Thomas work, noting how he examined Emma's chest, listening to her breathing, how he checked her pulse and looked at her fingernails and the whites of her eyes. He knew what he was doing, she realized. He had done this before. She needs water, he said finally. Cool water, little sips, as much as she'll take, and willow bark tea for the fever. His voice was matter of fact, neither angry nor kind, simply stating what needed to be done. The infection in her lungs is bad. I won't lie to you. It could go either way. Sarah felt something break inside her, some final wall she had been holding up through sheer will. Can you help her? Will you try? Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in a long time, something that might have been compassion. I'll try, he said. Now you need to eat something and rest. You're no good to her if you collapse. I'm not hungry, Sarah lied, even as her stomach cramped again. You'll eat anyway. Thomas stood and moved to the main room. He ladled beans into a bowl and brought it to her along with a piece of cornbread and a cup of water. The water she drank so fast it made her cough. The food she forced herself to eat slowly, though everything in her wanted to devour it like an animal. Thomas returned to Emma's bedside and continued his work, and Sarah watched him through the open doorway, unable to fully believe that this was happening, that someone was helping them, that they had not been turned away or worse. As the afternoon faded into evening, Thomas moved between the kitchen and the bedroom with quiet efficiency. He brewed tea from bark he kept in glass jars on a shelf, and he coaxed some of it past Emma's cracked lips, drop by drop. He changed the cooling cloths constantly, and he opened the window to let air move through the room. Sarah finished eating and came to stand in the doorway, watching, still not quite trusting enough to relax. "You can rest on the sofa," Thomas said without looking at her. "I'll watch her tonight." "I want to stay with her," Sarah said. Thomas nodded. "There's a chair here. But you should sleep. Morning will come whether you rest or not." Sarah pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. Emma looked so small against the white sheets, her face flushed and damp, her breathing still labored. Sarah reached out and took her sister's small hand in her own, feeling the fever heat of her skin. She wanted to pray but could not remember how. She wanted to believe that goodness existed in the world, that they had stumbled upon it by accident or providence. But belief was a luxury she had given up when she learned that adults could not be trusted, that family meant nothing, that the world was full of doors that closed in your face. "You ran away from somewhere," Thomas said quietly. It was not a question. Sarah said nothing. "I'm not asking you to tell me," Thomas continued. "Your business is your own, but I want you to know that you're safe here. For as long as you need to be, nobody will hurt you under my roof." Sarah looked at him, this stranger who had opened his door to two desperate children without hesitation, who was trying to save a sick girl for no reason except that she needed saving. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping us?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The firelight from the main room cast shadows across his weathered face. "I had a daughter once," he said finally, "Mary. She was about your age. And a wife, Catherine. This was their house, their home." He paused and Sarah saw old pain move behind his eyes. There was sickness 8 years back. Cholera came through these parts like a wildfire. I tried everything I knew, everything anyone suggested. But sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes you lose people anyway. Sarah felt tears burn her eyes again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. "I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand why this matters to me. After they died, I thought about giving up. Thought about putting a bullet in my head, or just walking into the desert and not coming back. But then I realized that the only way to honor their memory was to keep living, keep helping where I could. I couldn't save them. But maybe I can save someone else's daughter, someone else's sister. Maybe that has to be enough." The night deepened around them. Thomas kept the fire burning low, and he continued his vigil beside Emma's bed, monitoring her breathing, giving her sips of water and tea whenever she could take them, cooling her fevered skin with damp cloths. Sarah tried to stay awake, but exhaustion was a weight she could not carry any longer. She slumped in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the bed near Emma's hand, and sleep took her like a thief. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of Emma coughing. Sarah jerked upright, disoriented and afraid, but Thomas was there immediately, helping Emma sit up slightly, supporting her shoulders as she coughed weakly. The cough sounded terrible, wet and painful, but when it subsided, Emma's eyes opened, just for a moment, and Sarah saw awareness there, consciousness returning from wherever fever had taken it. Sarah breathed, reaching for her sister's other hand. Emma's eyes focused on Sarah's face, and she tried to smile, though her lips were too cracked to manage it properly. Her voice was barely a whisper. Thirsty, Thomas brought water and helped her drink small sips, patient and careful. "Good girl," he said quietly. "You're doing fine. Just rest now." Emma's eyes closed again, but her breathing seemed easier, less labored. Thomas checked her forehead and nodded with satisfaction. "Fever's breaking," he said to Sarah. "She's not out of danger yet, but she's fighting. That's a good sign." Sarah felt something unknot in her chest, some terrible tension she had been carrying for days. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Thank you." The days that followed took on a gentle rhythm that Sarah had never known before. Thomas cared for Emma with tireless patience, and he cared for Sarah too in his quiet way. He made sure she ate 3 meals a day, and he washed and mended their dresses, and he found shoes that had belonged to his daughter and offered them to Sarah without ceremony or emotion. The shoes were too big, but Sarah stuffed the toes with cloth and wore them anyway, grateful beyond words for something between her damaged feet and the hard ground. Emma improved slowly but steadily. The fever broke completely on the 3rd day, and though she remained weak and slept most of the time, she was able to eat thin soup and drink water without assistance. Color began to return to her cheeks, and her breathing cleared until it no longer rattled in her chest. Sarah spent hours sitting beside her, reading to her from Thomas's small collection of books or simply holding her hand, reassuring herself that Emma was still alive, still present, still hers. Thomas asked no questions about where they had come from or what they were running from. He went about his daily work, tending to his small garden, repairing fence posts, caring for the few chickens that scratched in the yard. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire and read, or sometimes he would carve small figures from pieces of wood, his knife moving with practiced ease. Sarah watched him sometimes, fascinated by the way a shapeless block could become a horse or a bird under his patient hands. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep and the night sounds of crickets filled the air outside, Sarah found the courage to speak the question that had been growing in her mind. "Can we stay?" she asked quietly. "Not forever, just until Emma is strong enough to travel." Thomas looked up from the horse he was carving. "Where will you go?" he asked. Sarah had no answer to that. She had not thought beyond survival, beyond the immediate need to keep Emma alive. The future was a vast unknown territory that frightened her more than the desert had. "You have nowhere to go," Thomas said. It was not a question. "You're running from someone who hurt you, and you're afraid they'll find you." Sarah said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Thomas set down his carving and regarded her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much. "You can stay," he said. "Both of you, as long as you need to. This house is too empty anyway, and there's enough room for 3. I could use help around the place, and Emma could do with regular meals and rest until she's properly healed. When you're ready to move on, I'll help you figure out where to go. But you don't have to leave. That's what I'm saying. You could stay, if you wanted to. Make this your home." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what he was offering. A home, a place to stay, safety. After everything she had known, everything she had endured, it seemed impossible that such things could be freely given, without cost or condition. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know us." "You don't owe us anything, no." Thomas agreed. "I don't owe you anything. But that's not why we help people, is it? We don't help because we owe it. We help because we can, because it's right. Because someone else might have once helped us when we needed it. My Catherine used to say that every act of kindness is a light in the darkness, and the world has more than enough darkness already." I figure she was right about that. Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to stop them. For so long she had believed that she and Emma were alone in the world, that no one cared whether they lived or died. She had learned to expect cruelty, to brace herself against it, to protect Emma from it as best she could. But Thomas Wade had opened his door to them, had fought for Emma's life as if she were his own child, had offered them sanctuary without asking anything in return. It was too much to understand, too much to accept, and yet here it was, solid and real and true. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me," Thomas said. "Just help me keep this place running, and make sure your sister grows up healthy and strong. That'll be thanks enough." Emma recovered fully over the following weeks. The color returned to her face, and her laughter filled the house again, bright and clear as bird song. She helped Sarah with simple chores, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, and she followed Thomas around like a shadow, asking endless questions that he answered with patient amusement. She was too young to fully understand what had happened, what they had escaped from, but she knew that they were safe now, and that was enough. Sarah worked hard, determined to prove her worth, to earn the kindness that had been given so freely. She learned to cook the simple meals Thomas favored, and she tended the garden with careful attention, and she mended fences and mucked out the chicken coop without complaint. At night, she would lie in the small bedroom that Thomas had given to her and Emma, listening to her sister's peaceful breathing. And she would think about the journey that had brought them here, about the door she had knocked on in desperation, about the man who had answered. She learned Thomas's story in pieces, gathered from brief comments and quiet moments. He had been a rancher once with a larger spread and hired hands, but after his family died, he had sold most of the land and kept only what he could manage alone. He had lived in solitude for years, and Sarah understood that solitude had been both a punishment and a refuge, a way of holding on to grief while keeping the world at bay. But now the house felt alive again, filled with voices and movement and the small sounds of daily living. Thomas never said so, but Sarah thought he was glad for the company, glad to have a purpose beyond simply enduring another day. As summer faded into autumn, Sarah began to believe in the permanence of things. She began to think that maybe they could stay, that this could truly be their home. Emma started learning her letters from Thomas's old books, and Sarah helped her practice, sounding out words by candlelight. They celebrated Emma's 7th birthday with a cake Thomas made himself, lopsided and burnt on one side, but sweeter than anything Sarah had ever tasted because it was made with love. One evening in late September, as they sat around the table after supper, Thomas cleared his throat in a way that suggested he had something important to say. Sarah tensed automatically, old instincts warning her that important conversations usually brought bad news. "I've been thinking," Thomas began, "and I wanted to talk to you both about something." He looked at Sarah first, then at Emma. "You've been here almost 4 months now, and you've made this place feel like a home again. I know you came here running from something, and I know you might still be afraid that you'll have to leave. So I want to make things official, if you're willing. I want to take you to town and speak to the judge. I want to formally adopt you both, make you my legal daughters. That way no one can take you away. You'll be Wade's, just like Catherine and Mary were. You'll have a name that protects you and a home that's yours by right." Sarah felt her world tilt. Emma made a small sound of joy and jumped up to hug Thomas around the neck, but Sarah sat frozen, unable to move or speak. Adopted daughters Wade's. The words echoed in her mind like a prayer she had not known she was allowed to say. "Sarah," Thomas said gently, looking at her over Emma's shoulder. "Is that something you'd want?" Sarah found her voice finally, though it came out thick with tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, please. More than anything." Thomas smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face and made him look younger, almost happy. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "We'll ride into town tomorrow and take care of it proper. You'll be Sarah Wade and Emma Wade, and this will be your home for as long as you want it." That night, Sarah lay in bed beside Emma, listening to her sister's quiet breathing, and she thought about all the doors in the world. Some doors opened onto darkness, onto pain and fear and everything she had run from. But some doors opened onto light, onto safety and kindness and the possibility of healing. She thought about how close she had come to not knocking, how she had almost turned away from Thomas Wade's house out of fear and distrust. She thought about how a single moment of desperate courage had changed everything, had saved not just Emma's life but both their futures. The next morning, they rode into town in Thomas's wagon, Sarah and Emma dressed in clean clothes that Thomas had bought from the general store on an earlier trip. The town was small, just a handful of buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but to Sarah it felt momentous, significant. They found the judge in his office above the courthouse, a kindly man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who listened to Thomas explain the situation in simple terms. 2 orphaned girls who needed a home, a widower with room in his heart and his house. The paperwork was surprisingly simple, just a few forms to sign and a statement from Thomas that he would provide for them and raise them as his own. The judge smiled at Sarah and Emma. "You girls are lucky," he said. "Thomas Wade is a good man. You'll have a fine home with him." "We know," Sarah said quietly. "We're already lucky." They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and Sarah looked at the landscape with new eyes. This was her home now, truly and legally. These red hills and endless skies belonged to her in a way that nothing ever had before. Thomas Wade was her father now, not by blood but by choice, which seemed to Sarah like a deeper bond, a more meaningful connection. That evening, Thomas took down a box from the top shelf of his closet and brought it to the table. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age, of a woman with kind eyes and a young girl with braids and a gap-toothed smile. "Catherine and Mary," he said, his voice soft. "I want you to know about them, to know whose home you're living in. They would have liked you both." Catherine would have fussed over Emma and made sure she was properly fed, and Mary would have pestered Sarah to play with her from sunup to sundown. He smiled at the memory. "They're gone, but they're still part of this house, still part of me. And now they're part of you too. Family doesn't end just because people leave. It keeps growing, keeps making room for new people who need it." Sarah looked at the photographs, at these women she would never meet, but who had shaped the man who had saved them. "Thank you for sharing them with us," she said. "We'll honor their memory. We'll make this home everything they would have wanted it to be." The years that followed were not perfect. There were hard times and lean winters, sickness that had to be nursed and storms that had to be weathered. But there was also laughter and learning, celebration and growth. Emma grew tall and strong, her childhood illness nothing but a distant memory. Sarah grew into a capable young woman who could run a ranch as well as any man, who learned from Thomas the value of hard work and honest dealing. They became a family in the truest sense, bound not by blood but by choice and love and shared experience. Sometimes late at night, Sarah would remember that desperate journey across the desert, the weight of Emma in her arms, the fear that had driven each step. She would remember standing on Thomas Wade's porch, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether they lived or died. She would remember the sound of her knocking, 3 hard raps that had echoed like a heartbeat in the hot afternoon air. And she would remember the door opening, revealing not the cruelty she had learned to expect, but the kindness she had barely dared to hope for. That memory would fill her with gratitude, so profound it felt like prayer. And she would whisper thanks into the darkness, thanks for the courage that had made her knock, thanks for the man who had answered, thanks for the second chance they had been given when they had nowhere else to turn. The desert still stretched endlessly beyond their property line, vast and unforgiving, and somewhere in that wilderness were the things they had run from. But Sarah no longer looked back toward those shadows. She looked instead at the life they had built, the home they had made, the family they had chosen. She looked at Emma healthy and happy and free. She looked at Thomas, aging but content, fulfilled by the purpose they had given him. And she knew that every hard step of that terrible journey had been worth it, that every moment of fear and pain had led them exactly where they needed to be. In the end, Sarah learned that salvation could come from the most unexpected places, that family could be built from strangers, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was knock on a door and ask for help. She learned that the world held both great cruelty and great kindness, and that the measure of a person was which of those they chose to offer when given the chance. Thomas Wade had chosen kindness, and in doing so, he had saved not just 2 lives but transformed them, given them roots and wings and a reason to believe that goodness still existed in the world. The ranch house stood white against the red earth, smoke rising from its chimney, a place of warmth and safety in the vast indifference of the desert. Inside, a family lived and worked and grew together, bound by love and choice, and the memory of a desperate knock on a stranger's door. And though the world beyond their property line remained harsh and unforgiving, within those walls there was grace, there was mercy, there was home.